Since the beginning of the pandemic crisis, you frequently heard me refer to saving a life as Judaism's primary mitzvah, our highest religious obligation. It is not, however, our only obligation. In the United States today, and in much of the world, policymakers in government, in business, and even in our congregation must balance priorities. Millions of Americans have lost their jobs, at least temporarily, threatening our neighbors' ability to pay rent or mortgage, utility bills, and for basic groceries. Thankfully, government assistance has helped tremendously in many cases. Still, public assistance may not last forever. Business owners must be able to recommence operations at some point, or job losses that might have been temporary may become permanent, and we may face a depression to rival the Great One. In that context, investigating the details of the mitzvah of saving life becomes not only relevant, but critical. When we isolate at home and keep businesses closed, we are balancing two critical values: keeping people safe from coronavirus on the one hand, and risking the well-being of our neighbors who cannot survive long-term without work. In recent weeks, I was privileged to study, by live stream naturally, with my teacher, Dr. Ilana Stein-Hain of the Shalom Hartman Institute. She explored with us the traditional texts that establish the priority of pikuach nefesh, saving a life. Admittedly, our rabbis did not consider the balance between saving lives and jobs. Instead, as Dr. Hain explains, they asked what should happen when a religious obligation, a spiritual matter, comes into conflict with saving a life. Our rabbis pondered a pile of rubble discovered on Shabbat with the possibility that a person buried underneath could be saved. Clearing the rubble should, under normal circumstances, be a grave violation of the Sabbath. However, Dr. Hain explains our rabbis permitted that even if they could not be certain that a person was buried underneath it all, let alone any assurance that a life could actually be saved. Even in cases of doubt, our rabbis placed saving a life higher than other values they held most dear. Many of us are aware that Brit Milah, the covenant of circumcision, is commanded to take place on the 8th day, even if it falls on Shabbat, even on Yom Kippur. The rabbis bring that priority as evidence that saving a life comes first. They ask rhetorically, if we violate the Sabbath for one limb, in this case the foreskin, shouldn't we violate the Sabbath for an entire body? The answer for the rabbis is obvious. Rabbi Akiva takes the argument even further. He notes that a danger to human life is sufficient to override even the sacrifices in the ancient temple. Dr. Hain emphasizes that Akiva has now elevated life-saving. It is no longer merely an act that overrides religious obligation. Saving a life is a way of serving God, a mitzvah, tantamount to offering a sacrifice on the temple altar. You may know that the law about saving lives comes with exceptions. Tosefta, the 3rd century text that lays out these laws, explains there is nothing that overrides saving a life except idolatry, illicit sexual unions, and murder. Elsewhere we learn, though, that the average Jew, faced with choosing between worshiping false gods on the one hand or death on the other should go ahead and feign idolatry. Some may agree that saving lives is primary, but understandably ask, who should decide what constitutes saving a life? In our current predicament, most of us are free to make our own decisions about the level of risk we can tolerate. Many of us follow the advice of national experts or of our own doctors in making those decisions. We certainly hope that our state and federal leaders are making decisions on the basis of infectious disease and epidemiological evidence and expertise. Often we learn, as on the front page of this morning's Democrat Gazette, that even guidelines developed by the Centers for Disease Control are reportedly shelved out of sight on orders from the highest levels of our federal government. The Talmud also asks, who decides about saving a life? Specifically, the case is, who decides whether a sick person is required to eat on Yom Kippur in order to sustain their life? Their answer? If either the patient or the doctor says that the patient must eat in order to survive, then that person must eat, even on our most solemn day of fasting. In short, we follow whoever would take the more stringent steps to save lives. In the end, of course, Jewish tradition cannot tell us when we may appropriately eat in a restaurant, get our hair cut, or gather in worship. Specific standards must be established by experts, as the Talmud suggests. For example, professionals tell us that 14 days of sustained decline in new infections should allow one level of reopening, while full return to normalcy requires development of a vaccine and a reliable treatment, with several other steps in between. As for the temple, in recent weeks, our musicians, Eileen and others who make the live stream happen, Carol, Candlelighters, and I have all brought Friday night worship to you from our homes. Government restrictions never forced that. The more stringent standard was our own sense of what was necessary to protect ourselves. With slowing of infections locally, 4 of us in the room tonight have felt comfortable gathering in the sanctuary to bring worship to you from this sacred place, observing in some ways you could notice and others you could not the rather stringent guidelines for worship laid out by our governor. I, for one, cannot wait to welcome worshipers back into this sanctuary. Jewish tradition calls on us to worship in the presence of a minyan, at least 10 Jewish adults, a standard we well exceed on Friday nights and comfortably meet on Saturday mornings. Yes, participants via live stream count. Still, let's admit it, nothing is the same as being here together. In the words of Carol Parham, felt at a very deep level, I miss seeing everybody. Perhaps, though, Rabbi Natan puts it best many centuries ago when he wrote, violate one Sabbath for someone to save their life so that they will keep many Sabbaths in the future. For Judaism and our Jewish religious practice, and I would argue for much else in our lives, doing everything we can to protect our lives and the lives of others takes precedence. Our Torah portion this week, Parashat Emor, describes observance of all kinds of our major holy days in the ancient temple: Shabbat, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Passover, and Shavuot. We have already observed several Sabbaths during this pandemic, and we celebrated Passover too. We have found creative ways to continue and even, I dare say, enhance our Jewish lives at this difficult time. And we shall continue to do so, even if necessary, and surely it will be for at least some of our members on the high holy days. Then may we celebrate countless future Sabbaths and holy days here together in our sacred sanctuary in good health. L'chaim, to life. Amen.